Yeah, thank you, Amy and Xander, for the introduction. The title of the talk I'm giving today is Reference Conditions and Spatial Pattern, and as you said, it's focused primarily on dry mixed conifer forests in the Southwest. And it's work that I did over the last couple of years at Northern Arizona University in collaboration with the Ecological Restoration Institute and working with Andrew and David Huffman, as well as Kristen Waring down there. And so before I get started, though, I want to thank some of the folks that really made this project possible, some of the staff members, students, and faculty at ERI and Northern Arizona University, and also our funders, the NAU School of Forestry and the U.S. Forest Service. So we often talk about heterogeneity and the NRV as being goals and objectives in silvicultural prescriptions. And we know that heterogeneity is a really, really valuable part of these ecosystems, and it was probably very important historically as well. And so the goal of this project was really to quantify the stand scale and fine scale spatial pattern of dry mixed conifer forests in the Southwest. By quantifying these structures, we're able to develop evaluation criteria with which we can judge the effectiveness of these treatments. And this is particularly important, I think, in dry mixed conifer because it's a very poorly understood ecosystem, and because, in general, the term heterogeneity is a fairly ambiguous thing. We know it's something we want, but it's hard to figure out how to get there. And so in doing this project, we established 4 sites on the Mogollon Rim and 4 sites in the San Francisco Peaks. And as you can see, Flagstaff is right about here. The San Francisco Peaks are about 10 minutes northwest of Flagstaff. And our Mogollon Rim sites were about a 2.5-hour drive southeast of Flagstaff, right at the edge of the Mogollon Rim at about 7,500 to 8,000 feet. And in all 8 of these sites, these were 1 hectare fixed area plots, 100 meter by 100 meter plots, or about 2.5 acres each. We performed dendrochronological reconstruction of the forest structure and pattern on each site. And so moving on to the results, on the San Francisco Peaks, we found, as you can see, very low densities historically, at least in comparison to other dry mixed conifer forest sites in the Southwest. And historically, very few shade-tolerant species. This example site here was primarily dominated by ponderosa pine, with a few Douglas fir right here, and a few aspen as well. And so these circles are individual trees. The colors are scaled by relative shade tolerance, and the size of the circles are scaled by crown radius of the tree, or predicted crown radius of the tree. So as you can see, substantial increases in density and shifts in species composition on the San Francisco Peaks. And moving on to the Mogollon Rim, I should mention that when we reconstructed these to the year of fire exclusion on each site. So on the Peaks, that was about 1876, and on the Mogollon Rim, that was a little bit later in 1879, but the last fire was recorded on the site. But you can see similar trends, even though the Mogollon Rim is a much more productive site, a much wetter, warmer site than the Peaks. And there's also white fir on the site, which there's not on the San Francisco Peaks. Still very similar trends from historical data to today. We predict that there was a pretty substantial increase. But as you can see, historically, about twice the density that we saw on the Peaks. So thinking about stand scale spatial pattern, when I talk about spatial pattern, really I'm discussing 3 different scales. One is the landscape scale, in which we're talking about changes in density, composition, and in some cases pattern across the landscape in different stands. And those are often a reflection of disturbance history or site characteristics. But we also think about spatial pattern at the mid-scale or stand scale, and this is from about 10 acres to about 50 acres. But those numbers are in the GTR 310 that I cite here. And at the stand scale, we can have patterns that are either aggregated, where trees are likely to appear in groups, or there's some sort of advantage to showing up in groups. We can also have random distributions of trees in which the location of each tree isn't necessarily influenced by characteristics of the site or heterogeneity of disturbance. And then we can also have uniform patterns, and these are fairly uncommon in ecological systems, but you might see these in creosote bushes in the desert, or a plantation environment, or a minimum spacing-based bin in the WUI treatments. And lastly, we think about fine-scale spatial pattern. And so in fine-scale pattern, we often think about single trees or tree groups, individual trees that have interlocking crowns. And we also think about interstitial spaces or openings between trees. And we didn't quantify the space or opening in this study, but that's something that Andrew and I have been working on over the last few months. And we should have a publication out in about a year or so about that. So in regards to spatial pattern, on the San Francisco peak, we found that 1 out of 4 plots was significantly aggregated. And this varies from what we know about ponderosa pine forests, in which ponderosa pine and basaltic soils are often in those aggregated groups. We also know that this site, at least, had trees that were primarily in small groups or in individual trees, and relatively small maximum group sizes. This is influenced a little bit by the plot size that we were using. But as you can see, not very large groups. And then on the Mogollon Rim, you can see quite a bit different. So this reflects the heterogeneity of the system of dry mixed conifer. We have 3 out of 4 plots that were significantly aggregated, and a max group size a little bit larger, about 9 trees with interlocking crowns. And one thing that I felt like was particularly important to look for in this system, being a mixed species system, is the role of different species in the overall spatial pattern. And what we found is that white fir and hardwoods tended to grow more often in groups than other species, and this sort of makes sense. White fir being gray shade tolerant, and hardwoods, at least all the hardwoods on the sites that we were looking at, tend to sprout out of the same established root systems after disturbance. Whereas ponderosa pine were more likely to grow as isolated single trees away from groups, probably a reflection again of the shade tolerance of that species. And Douglas fir and southwestern white pine, or the mid-tolerance that we were looking at, were present across all group sizes. And so I'm just going to briefly touch on this because Amy is going to discuss it a little more in detail later on. But the 4 sites on the Mogollon Rim were in close proximity to proposed treatment blocks in the Mogollon Learn project, and our findings will be used to help inform restoration treatments in these areas. And so with that, I'll take your questions.
Great, thank you, Kyle. That's very concise but clear overview. It look like we have any questions right now. Oh, good. Okay. So you can see Tim's question in the chat window there. He asks whether individual trees, oak root sprouts, let's see. Maybe I'm having a little bit of trouble reading that. Maybe I'll unmute the line, and Tim, you can. Okay, Tim. I'll go ahead and unmute the line. Tim, if you want to just ask your question out loud, you're welcome to do it that way too.
Alrighty. Specifically, I was just wondering if you distinguish between oak root sprout groups or if a cluster of oaks was simply assumed to be individual trees.
Right. So, yeah, thanks for the question, Tim. For the analysis that we performed, we considered all individual sprouts as individual trees, and obviously in an ecological sense that may not make a lot of sense, but for the analysis it was a lot easier to perform that way, and it's also part of the system. They resprout from the same root systems, and it would be hard to differentiate different groups and figure out which ones are connected and which ones aren't.
Great. Are there any other, the line is now open, so if there are any other questions right now about Kyle's talk, we can take those, or we can move on to the next presentation, and there may be more questions that come up as we integrate some of these presentations. Oh, we have another one from Ellis. So Ellis asks, how confident were you in the stand reconstructions in the wetter environment with species that tend to decompose faster than pine, for example, aspen?
Yeah, that's a great question, Ellis. And it's actually something that I've been thinking a lot about recently. We have a fellow student that just graduated from NAU that was looking at the decomposition rates of ponderosa pine, and as a lot of people I'm sure are aware, ponderosa pine decomposes quite a bit slower than other species, at least in these systems. And so what we know is that based on some studies that were done by the ERI and some of the folks affiliated with them, is that these methods are really, really effective in ponderosa pine and some of the dry mixed conifer sites. There have been some studies on the north rim of the Grand Canyon that suggest that we're missing a lot of the aspen. But in terms of aspen on the Mogollon Rim side, at least, it wasn't a huge component historically, we don't think. There's not a lot of it there today. There's not a lot of standing snags or any sort of evidence. And in terms of the larger conifers like white fir that might be decomposing a little bit quicker, often there are still evidences in terms of stump holes or things that persist for quite a long time, even if the tree's not there anymore. So I can't say that I'm incredibly confident in these methods for reconstructing the density of hardwoods, but I would say in terms of conifers, they are pretty effective for our purposes.
Great. Thanks, Kyle. I'll go ahead and mute participants again. And maybe with that, it makes sense to hold the rest of our questions towards the end, and we can engage in sort of discussion questions. But for now, I'll turn it over to, actually, let's see. First, I'll make sure I try to do this correctly so everything works out. I'll turn it over to Amy and more importantly, for right now, Judy Springer, to work on the next segment. Thank you.
Thanks, Xander. Thanks, Kyle. So I do work for the Ecological Restoration Institute, and this particular paper was a systematic review with Scott Abella. He was the lead on it, and he is currently at UNLV. And we published this, I believe it was earlier this year, 2015, and so the bulk of this study, or the bulk of my presentation, is actually going to be the results we got from this systematic review. And because I only have 15 minutes, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about the methods that we used for the review. This review is available on the ERI website if you go to the ERI library on our website, and we'll have an address at the end of all of the presentations where you can access that article for free. So I'll go through the results of the literature review, and then we are going to do a presentation at the end, Amy is, on our long-term ecological assessment and restoration network that we have primarily in the Southwest. And I wanted to cover a couple of those studies, just a slide apiece, so you guys can kind of get an idea of what we're finding in these sites, and I'll just be covering some of our mixed conifer sites. And then Amy's going to cover in a lot more detail what the results we found on the Wildfire in eastern Arizona, but I wanted to just show you a couple of slides on the effects on understory vegetation there because it was mixed conifer. And then I'll finalize my presentation with a slideshow of restoration treatments around the Southwest that we gathered as part of the systematic review. So that's what I'm going to be covering in the next 15 minutes. And these are hard, you know, you're watching this from your desktop, and it's hard to be interactive here, but I want everybody to look at this map and just spend some time looking at it. This systematic review is west-wide, mixed conifer west-wide, and this is a map of all the studies, the locations of them, and the shaded areas are our best guess of where mixed conifer is found in the west. It was really, really hard to track down good sources of information or even just good definitions of what mixed conifer is. It's extremely variable, as most of you know, throughout the West. And so we had to use a number of different sources to try to compile where mixed conifer actually is located. So that's what the shaded areas are. And then you can see the ecoregions. I believe we used Nature Conservancy for those. And then you'll see the numbers they correspond to the studies that we included in the review. And if you guys were in the same room with me, I'd ask you what you're seeing with this map, but I'm seeing Colorado. We didn't detect any studies in Colorado, even though there's a lot of mixed conifer there. I don't know if that's an artifact of just not locating those papers, or if there really wasn't anything in Colorado that matched our criteria for the review. And then you can see a few scattered studies in Arizona and New Mexico, but the bulk of the studies were in the Sierra Nevadas, and we had 5 studies from British Columbia that were in mixed conifer. We didn't locate any in Mexico, even though there is mixed conifer in Mexico. And then finally, you'll see up in the Pacific Northwest, for Pacific Northwest coast, that ecoregion, we chose not to include studies from there because the precipitation is so much higher than the rest of the area. But we did have one study, I think that was from Mount Rainier, and somehow it made it into the study. So that's why we don't have a lot of studies from the coast in our review. So as I mentioned, I won't go into any detail about our methods. You can find that in the paper in excruciating detail, how we did the systematic review, what our criteria were, why we might have excluded studies. We excluded studies sometimes because the precipitation was too high, or perhaps it didn't have mixed conifer species. We had about, I would say about 6 or 7 species that dominated throughout the papers, and they included Douglas fir, white fir, Jeffrey pine, sugar pine, incense cedar, and Engelmann spruce, and then we had 9 other species. So those were some of our indicator species for whether it was truly mixed conifer. And then we asked, it was 5 questions in the review that we tried to answer with the review. And so because it was a systematic review, oftentimes we didn't have charts to show what we found, but rather than showing you a lot of data slides, I'm just going to show you what the answers were to these questions if we were able to find answers. So the first question was, do tree cutting and managed fire, and that would include prescribed or wildland fire use. We didn't look at wildfire. And then tree cutting plus managed fire. Do these treatments have different effects on total understory plant abundance and species richness? And what we found was that cutting and prescribed fire, when applied alone, they increased the abundance or richness in about half of the studies, but on the other hand, about half the time, these same factors, abundance and richness, decreased. So it was kind of a wash. And then we found that cutting plus fire, when combined, they actually led to reduced abundance in nearly all studies, but that richness increased in about half the studies. And I'll give you some reasons why we think that is later in future slides. And then we had a second question. Our understory metrics, such as plant cover and species richness, do they relate to the time since the tree cutting or the time since fire? In other words, does it matter how long ago these treatments occurred? Does that have any impact on these metrics? And so what we found that was long-term studies had increases in abundance after cutting or prescribed fire if it was longer than 4 years. However, cutting and prescribed burning, we don't know because we weren't able to find any studies that were older than, or that collected data more than 4 years. So we don't know. And then with species richness, we didn't have enough long-term studies, so we don't know yet. We need more papers to be able to answer this. But what we did find was that there's usually an eventual infilling by woody species with time. Question number 3. Do responses to these disturbances vary among plant groups, such as graminoids and forbs or natives and non-natives? What we found here was that forbs and graminoids increased more frequently in abundance, and this was across all treatment types. So they increased more frequently than shrubs did. Shrubs took a hit. Non-native richness increased the most when you combine cutting with burning. But however, we found that non-natives comprised a very small portion of the total cover in richness. So usually non-natives were less than 10%, I think, in all of our papers, and oftentimes more, closer to 1% or a few percent. So they weren't a big component in mixed conifer forests. And then question number 4, do understory responses to tree cutting and fire differ between moist and dry mixed conifer forests? So we thought we would find a strong relationship between the responses and precip, but we didn't. And then we didn't identify any studies that identified or that compared moist to dry mixed conifer. And I should go back and say that we found 50 papers and 41. We used data from 41 studies, so that's what I'm drawing from here. And the reason we had more papers than studies that we used was because sometimes studies would collect, or research projects would collect data twice and publish it twice, so we only used the most recent paper. That's how we collected our information for the systematic review. And then question number 5, how do understory responses vary with intensity of tree cutting or severity of fire? A lot of papers didn't include information on how much basal area was removed, or they didn't include the severity of fire, so we had mixed results, and we weren't able to identify a lot of that information to answer this question. And we found that high severity burning led to a greater increase in total plant abundance and richness, more so than low severity burning did. So those are the 5 questions, and then I wanted to switch over real quick to more of a slideshow portion of the talk. And this is one of our Learn sites that Amy will probably be talking about later. It's in Pagosa Springs, Colorado, in the San Juan National Forest. And this is a study that the ERI collaborates with the San Juan on. And we collected data, pre-treatment data in 2003, and went back a few times. And the series of pictures on the right, and I guess I should be using my little pointer to with you guys. 2013 was 5 years after treatments occurred. So if you look on the pictures on the left, you can see that we had a thin burn treatment on the upper left. We had a burn only in the middle, and then untreated on the bottom. And you will notice on the right, 5 years following treatments, that there's, in the thin and burn treatment, a heavy ingrowth of young, or I shouldn't say young, they're Gamble oak sprouts. And then in the burn only, you can see that we did have some mortality, but there's a lot of undergrowth coming in, a lot of understory plants responding. But then in the untreated area, you can see that the 2003 and 2013 pictures from the same plot look pretty similar, I would say. And this paper was published by Mike Stoddard as the lead author here at the ERI, and it's available on the ERI website. It's called 5-Year Post-Restoration Conditions and Simulated Climate Change Trajectories, a Warm, Dry, Mixed Conifer Forest in southwestern Colorado, so you can find that on the ERI website. And then here is another published study from the Apache Sitgreaves National Forest in Arizona near Vernon. And the lead author on the study was Rob Strahan, and this has been published also very recently. And we don't have the most recent version on the ERI website, but I'll make sure we get that up there. There is an in-press version available. And it's called Increasing Weight of Evidence That Thinning and Burning Treatments Help Restore Understory Plant Communities in Ponderosa Pine Forest. So even though it's a Ponderosa Pine study primarily, we also, as you can see in this picture, we were in the transition into mixed conifer. So this one's got some really interesting results from a number of sites throughout the Southwest, if you want to take a look at that paper. And then Amy will talk in more detail about the Wildfire, but we collected data on the Wildfire in eastern Arizona and the Apache Sitgreaves. And this is just one chart, one figure from the paper showing the response of the understory between the treated and the untreated. And you can see that total cover, there was a significantly greater amount of total cover of understory species in the treated areas. And so when I say treated, I mean that these areas were treated prior to the Wildfire coming through. So we have an interesting paper that Amy will talk about that I'd recommend reading, also available on the ERI website. And then another figure on total plant cover again from the Wildfire. And you can see here the significantly greater plant cover in areas that were treated prior to the Wildfire. And then these areas, the high severity areas, were seeded with non-native wheat and rye. So these numbers of the percentage of native and non-native species in these plots is related to how much non-native species were seeded. So 24% of the non-native species were, oops, I actually covered up the number. 24% of non-natives were actually seeded species in the treated area, and then 50% of non-natives in the untreated area were probably mostly barley and wheat, or rye and wheat. And then these are just some pictures from the Wallace Fire from our treatment effectiveness study, same study as the last two slides, and Amy will also be talking about. But I really like slideshows just to show you. I really do think a picture's worth 1,000 words. So this is an untreated area, so it wasn't thinned prior to the Wallace Fire for WUI treatments. And this area burned, and you can this is just mainly to show you the incredible variability that we have in the Wallace Fire. So in this upper left picture, you can just see the ingrowth of aspen sprouts, and then this area in the upper right was burned, but you can see char on the trees, but there's not much going on below that in the understory. However, check out the understory response in the lower left and in the lower right. So you can just see the extreme variability you get following wildfire. And then this is a treated area where the Forest Service actually thinned trees prior to the wildfire, and again, pretty extreme variability. Not much going on in the lower left, but you can just see pretty incredible responses in some of these other areas with the understory. And so the study conclusions that we came up with in a nutshell were that the understory measures often declined initially due to the severity of fire at times, but if the canopy was reduced to about half what it was prior to treatment, then you get an increase in the understory. So you do need a pretty large decrease in canopy cover to get a response. And then we think some fire-stimulated native species might come up if they've been gone following prescribed burning or wildfire, but we need more information and more data to determine that. And then non-native species in mixed conifer are generally sparse after cutting and prescribed fire. They don't seem to be as prevalent as they are in ponderosa pine. And so I want to wrap up. I just have a real quick slideshow I want to run through with you guys. So, I forgot. I have a big slide of unanswered questions. So like anything else, whenever there's a study, you always end up with more unanswered questions than you had to begin with. So I won't run through all of this, but basically we just don't know what some of the interactions are. We don't know what the responses are, how mixed versus dry mixed conifer forests differ. That doesn't make sense, does it? Anyway, I think it was supposed to say wet versus dry, not mixed. So responses were mixed and wet versus dry. And then long-term impacts is one of the things that we really need more information on. We didn't have a lot of long-term studies in the systematic review. A lot of the studies didn't collect data past 4 years. And then I won't go through everything on this slide, but those are our unanswered questions. And here's the slideshow. So I'll just run through this real quick. But Scott wrote to several of the authors of papers we included in the systematic reviews, and they were kind enough to send us pictures from their studies. So this one was from the Lincoln National Forest near Ruidoso, New Mexico, Cram and others, 2007. And so let's see, A and D, the top two pictures, are pre-treatment pictures. You can see there's not much going on in the understory. And then B and E, they did treatments that just involved thinning, no burning. And then C and F, you can see the results of the understory coming in. And then we have Lincoln National Forest near Cloudcroft from Mason and et al., 2009. Top row is untreated, and then just a thinning with scattered slash, no burning, and then thinning with piled slash. You can see the upper series of pictures, very dark, not much going on again. And then once you institute treatments, you start to open up the canopy and get more of a response. And then this is a study that ERI was involved with, prescribed burning in Grand Canyon National Park in 2005. Let's see, the series of pictures on the left, these are all areas that were not burned. And then on the right, you can see the response following prescribed burning. There's a rather hot prescribed burn that went through, so you can see a pretty large response here as opposed to the unburned areas. And then we have Kettle Experimental forests in the Sierras, and this is an untreated area, very little understory response. And then they did shelterwood treatments, one with, I guess they were all with prescribed burning, so you can see understory response in the bottom picture. And this was one of the few long-term studies we were able to uncover. So this was in the Sierra Nevadas again, and on the left in 1929, look at the, I can't tell for sure what, but it looks to me like a lot of shrub cover in 1929. And 2007, which is 79 years later, you can just see that those shrubs, or if they even were shrubs, I'm not sure, they're just basically gone, and it's mostly trees, very dark. So I think my time is up, and I wanted to acknowledge the Forest Service. I apologize to you guys who are on this presentation that I did not put you in the acknowledgments. The funding for this study came from the Forest Service, and then I wanted to acknowledge several other people at the ERI and the NAU campus and other folks throughout the area. And I think we have, I don't know if we have time for maybe one or two questions, if anybody has a question.
Yes, I think we can fit in a couple. So you participants are welcome to type things in the chat window and I can read them out. Or, let's see, I think maybe I'll try to unmute the line here. I think I've unmuted the line now. Maybe I've toggled and I can't remember which side of the toggle I'm on now. But feel free to ask your questions. Here's someone furiously typing, so that I think means I did unmute it.
Hey, so, Amy, this is Kyle. I might have missed this, but did you guys look at all at the seasonality of prescribed fires and how that might influence understory response?
No, we didn't. I don't know if that wasn't a question we had originally. I don't think it was one of our questions, but it has come up in other types of forests. And Eric Knapp did a really nice review in, I think, in ponderosa pine, but when it comes to mixed conifer, we don't really know that much about the seasonality, but it'd be worth looking into for sure. But no, we didn't look at seasonality at all.
Okay.
Any other questions out there? Okay, well, maybe we'll, I'll try to mute the line here, and maybe we'll dive into the next presentation, and because I think there's some good connections there, and thanks, Amy, you're on the ball. We're able to navigate our system, and with that, I'll turn it over to you to talk about wildfire severity and metrics of forest resilience.
Okay, thanks, Xander. Judy always wows us, so she just wowed everybody into submission. Okay, well, I don't know where that's from, but this is a study that ERI did. So I've got a deep bench in the room today, so I'm Stoddard sitting here too, who's one of the co-authors on the paper. So if I get really tough questions, I get to hand them off to both Mike and Judy. But this was a treatment effectiveness study that we wanted to kind of push the limits of a little bit to look at ecological impacts of treatment in the line of a wildfire that we could maybe characterize as uncharacteristic, and the potential for how we define resiliency in those situations. So I think most of the audience on this call, Southwestern audience, and is well familiar with the Wallace Fire. It's starting to feel a while ago. It burned in 2011. It was what people like to call a mega fire. It burned about 540,000 acres. 17% of that was dry mixed conifer. The shading on the map actually represents all mixed conifer, but just about 17% is dry. Our quick methods this was an opportunistic study in 2012. We went into the area. We were funded by the Forest Service to kind of look at effectiveness of the treatment. And we know that in this area, there's been a lot of investment through the White Mountain Stewardship, which is what WMS is, in fuels reduction treatments, restoration treatments, primarily to protect the communities there. So we established a paired treatment design, identifying White Mountain Stew fuel reduction treatments that were less than 10 years old and pairing them with adjacent untreated areas that happened to line up in the same fire progression time frame. We had some minimal criteria. These units had to be at least 30 acres in size. They were in the warm-dry mixed conifer type, and the treatments included mechanical thinning that could have been commercial or non-commercial thinning, but had to be followed by some residual fuels, surface fuels removal. That could have been either a mechanical removal, which there's a lot of biomass utilization in the eastern counties of Arizona, or a prescribed fire. So it's great to follow. Judy and I tag team very well together. She showed you a lot of pictures of wallow. We saw a lot of mixed severity effects in that landscape with a big range in patch sizes of the severity. And I think it's worth just commenting that the largest high severity patch sizes are in the southern part of that fire footprint, which is near the origin of the fire and often at some higher elevations in some of the higher mixed conifer. But because of the intent of the White Mountain Stew, most of those treatments are up in the northern extent of the fire around those communities on the map. So just keep that in mind. So our very, very first question, which meets the treatment effectiveness, is if the fuel reduction treatments were effective in mitigating burn severity under what we're calling the wildfire severe wildfire conditions. And to get at this, we looked just really quickly, not quickly, at tree mortality. And these are some of our initial results, well, our published results. And these graphs are copied right from the paper, so of course they're in metric units, but I'm gonna give you the English right here, so don't worry about it. But we looked at, if you look over here, this is density. This margin here is trees per hectare, but I'll talk about them in trees per hectare. And down here is the basal area. And these columns on the left are both the treated stands, and these are the paired untreated on the right. And what's significant is the wildfire killed a lot of trees. It killed it in our treated units, and it killed them in the untreated units. So that's good to remember. In the treated units, actually, we had about 53% of all species overstory trees killed after the wildfire went through. In the untreated areas, that was 74%. So in the treated units, we saw a total of 80 trees per acre result in an average of 35 trees per acre following the wallow. In the untreated stands, those started with about 450 trees per acre on average and ended up with about 120. As often happens, there's corresponding losses in those basal areas, so about 30% reduction in basal area in the treated stands and 55% in the untreated stands. Oh, you know what? I'm just going to say, so these treatments, the White Mountain Stew, they're really designed to meet our fuel reduction objectives. They included removing less fire resilient species and small diameter trees. So I just want to remind you guys of that. As Judy showed, there was high variability in both these treated and untreated stands. In the treated plots, total tree mortality ranged from about 25% to as high as 82%. So we still saw a lot of mortality in those treated plots. Untreated plots showed a range of 42% to 98% tree mortality. So we did have one plot with almost all trees killed. Mike's nodding his head. Good. I'm getting confirmation here. Okay. One thing then, I want to switch gears because that's our treatment effectiveness study. Mortality and severity are often our metrics to look at treatment effectiveness, but it's really just that one part of the study. And often our studies are limited. And this is for a good reason. We understand where our priorities are. They're dictated by funding priorities, by congressional acts. So in the last 15 years, we've seen the National Fire Plan, the Healthy Forest Initiative, the Healthy Forest Restoration Act, and even our stimulus funding in 2009 and 2013 really concentrated on hazardous fuels reduction to protect our high-valued areas. And those are our communities. That's our first priority. So it makes sense that when we want to look at how effective those treatments are, we are looking to see, did those treatments reduce fire severity and allow our firefighters increased opportunities for protection or suppression activities? And I think while there's high variability in the published studies out there on treatment effectiveness, we do show overall high effectiveness and protection of those high-valued areas. But one thing we wanted to look at with this study is to ask a slightly different question about resiliency. We wanted to look at the treatments, how they impacted our forests with ecological metrics, and if these opportunistic studies could inform our understanding of resiliency. And it kind of fits right now. We have a national policy to make our national forest system lands more resilient to climate change. The cohesive strategy goal includes building more resilient landscapes. So it's a real good word now to understand how does that translate to what we're measuring on the ground. Resiliency is defined, this is Halling, 1973, the ability of a system to absorb a perturbation or a novel disturbance and return to a similar set of structures and processes. The Forest Service had some draft directives that used that definition as well. I think a final is in place now, and you guys might know it better than I do. This still has some gaps. You know, to really define resiliency requires a few parameters, including the resilience of what to what. So that's what we tried to look opportunistically to do here. Our big question is, what does resiliency look like in mixed conifer forest? And similar to some of Judy's pictures, this is one of those high-intensity stands in the Wildfire, and you can see some of the dead aspen and spruce and fir, I think maybe fir and pine in there. But really what's coming up in the foreground is huge aspen regeneration. And this is just 1 year after the fire, and what some of the staff even on this call and our researchers have said is just incredible out there now. So we took a stab at defining resiliency in Arizona mixed conifer forests, and we used a couple of methodologies to do that. And what we picked are three broad areas in the orange here, and that was tree survivorship, basically including tree species and the diameter distribution, but also focused on large tree survivorship. We also looked at high severity patch size, and then we wanted to incorporate some of our understory data to look at non-native and native herbaceous understory cover and overall functional group cover. So the key to resiliency from the literature is to really integrate multiple ecological variables, and we're trying to look at what are the thresholds, where do we see potential regime shifts, because really if we go back to that Halling 73 definition, we're looking for where does that change occur that you're not returning to that structure and process. So for tree survivorship, really the historic range of variability can inform that. We can look at historic reference conditions for mixed conifer forests to try to develop these benchmarks for composition and structure. And Kyle spoke to what some of those are, and if Dave had spoken today, you would have also understood some of the fire. High severity patch size, this has been a much more difficult number to quantify. There are some benchmarks from historic reference conditions, and Ellis, who's on this call, has provided some big picture data on that information, and JP Roccaforte here at the ERI has as well. This study allowed us to just kind of look at those differences in patch sizes in areas that had been treated and were in the path of the wallow, and areas that weren't treated. And then for non-native, it's important. We know that in many systems, the opportunities that facilitate non-native invasion and dominance can also influence our ecosystem processes, like fire regime. So we felt it was an important component to assess for ecosystem resiliency. Complicated, I know. So here's a resiliency question that we asked. Do mixed conifer forests with fuel reduction treatments show higher resiliency based on those three characteristics than those without treatment? And here's our diameter data to look at all tree mortality. So this is the diameter distribution, and what we've done here is this column over here is before wallow. We have treated before and untreated before. then boom, wallow occurred, and then we have treated after wallow and untreated after wallow. And you see this is very typical of what we see in untreated forests down low, is that we have a high abundance of trees with small diameters, and then the wildfire can come in and change that distribution. There's also the species that we have here, and I realize they are scientific codes, but we had white fir, Engelmann spruce, ponderosa pine, southwestern white pine, aspen, and Doug fir. And if you look at the colors like the yellow, the peepo, ponderosa pine, and Doug fir, the dark, those are some of the most fire resilient species. So you can kind of track how they persisted through the fire event. But one thing we wanted to do for this resiliency question is not just look at the diameter distribution, but dive in a little bit more closely to that species distribution. And as you recall, we found that all treated plots and untreated plots had fairly decent mortality in trees. But where we saw a significant difference is in those fire resilient species. So this is data from our publication, and you'll notice that I've highlighted the total tree density and then the peepo one, the ponderosa pine one. And what I want to pull out here is that, yes, we had 32% mortality of total trees in treated and 56% in untreated. But what's really significantly different is the ponderosa pine in treated units, we only saw a 6% loss. Oh, and this is the key part. These are the large trees, which we thought is a good measure of resiliency of the system. So these are trees that are greater than 16 inches dBH. And then just what really always makes sense to people is this is our aspen, and we lost about 75% of those large aspen in both treated and untreated. Well, that's the adaptive characteristic of aspen. It doesn't survive a lot of active flame, but its adaptive quality is to resprout, and we saw that heavily on the system. So hopefully that makes sense. The next metric of resiliency we tried to examine was high severity patch size. We used the ravage data and characterized high severity as pixels with greater than 75% basal area loss. And this was really clear that we just looked at those treated and then paired untreated areas. Patch sizes were on the order of 10 times as large in the untreated forests. And then this is that data that Judy shared with you, the plant cover, native and non-native. And my point here is that I just wanted to stress is that there was this significantly higher plant cover in treated areas. But I hope, as you gathered from Judy's presentation, that's actually different than what you can find in a lot of these post-fire studies as well. So it's a highly variable place, and probably local factors influence what that understory response is. And just as Judy said, this number up here is the percent of that non-native that was actually seeded. And we didn't look at this, but when you tie this into the last slide where we saw those larger patch sizes of high severity burn, that's actually where the seeding was occurring, and they were prioritizing erosion control activities in those larger patch sizes. So that may contribute to why you actually picked up more of those planted species in that untreated area. Okay. So as we've defined, and we started calling them short-term resiliency metrics because, yes, we went in 2012, but what we found that fuel reduction treatments can additionally increase short-term resiliency metrics of forested ecosystems. We know that uncharacteristic fire does increase the risk to our human communities on that wild-urban land interface, but what we are trying to document more and more is how it impacts the ecological integrity across those larger landscapes. And so what we're suggesting in the study is that broader landscape restoration and fire hazard reduction efforts could be justified to increase resiliency across the landscape. And at this time, resiliency to climate change is pretty important. And when we think about the mixed conifer landscape and the future predictions for climate change in the Southwest, those include increased temperatures and potentially more variable precipitation with some really mixed predictions on whether we will get less precipitation or more. But what we know with those warming temperatures is that we will have bigger and longer windows for fire activity. So when we use our historic range of variability for these fire-adapted mixed conifer forests, it really lends us up to understanding, well, what's the future that we want for these forests with an increase in fire with climate change. I have to say some caveats about this study. This was an opportunistic study following the Wallace Fire. We utilized Apache Sitgreaves facts, their activity data layers, and I'm sure you guys can empathize with us. There's always challenges in looking at those databases and determining the differences between, for example, accomplished versus completed. We were able to field visit and verify when mechanical treatment, but where this was more difficult is we really wanted to work on areas where the surface fuels had also been treated. We give high thanks to Apache Sitgreaves staff. They were really able to help inform us on that as well. And we feel pretty confident about the units that we did end up using having been completely in that completed column. I have suppression activities in here twice because really this is such a hugely variable effort that we weren't able to quantify. And when we look at the Wallow input, the Wallow map, we know that those treatments were placed around communities, and a lot of times what we're able to do with these fire risk reduction treatments is utilize them actually for suppression activities, increasing black line and protection zones for those communities. We had a hard time in the heat of the moment, as you would say, understanding really where those suppression activities occurred. If I were to go back to the map, the communities to the north and east, we feel pretty confident had little of the back burning, but right around Greer, we understand they use a lot of back burning. So when we're comparing these treatments and we're saying it's in the same burning progression map, that didn't incorporate back burning. So that's a really difficult variable to tease apart when we're looking at the effects of these treatments. And I think that's all I have, and that paper is available, and I'm going to type in actually our website on the comments. And we do just want to thank, this was the crew that was out in 2012 putting in 180 plots. So I think that's all I have, and I'll take questions.
Great. Thank you, Amy. Excellent, excellent work there. So feel free to type questions in the chat window, and I'll go ahead and try to unmute the line here. And so if you have a question, you can ask it verbally just over the phone line as well. So I guess I'll abuse my privilege as a moderator here to ask you a question, Amy. This idea of suppression activities, have you seen any work similar to the Wallow work that you've done where they've been able to integrate that suppression as sort of a treatment factor almost? Or because the issue you discussed, I think you guys dealt with it better than most studies, but it is sort of a universal problem that treatments and suppression activities often go hand in hand.
I think it was a great question, and I can't think of anything off the top of my head. And Mike, are you thinking of anything?
Maybe just the complementary study by Johnson et al.
Oh, and I wanted to mention actually Morris Johnson's study. Yeah, so that might be a good one to look at. Morris Johnson and Kennedy published, I think, 2 now papers of the Wallow as well, and looked even more specifically, they did transects as the fire moved in, so they were able to better document treatment impacts, over distance, and maybe, they captured a little bit more.
And really focus on staying away from those suppression activities.
Yeah, and they were able to get more information to avoid them. I think that would be a great question to open up to this group, too. I would love to hear if people on the call have heard of that, because it would really help explain some of the variability, I think, and also opportunity.
Hey, Amy.
Yeah.
Hey, it's Valerie.
Hi, Valerie.
How's it going?
Good.
I'm just curious, and I might have missed it, but did you guys look at soil integrity at all?
Oh, we didn't. We assessed soil severity, I think, because we were there in 2012. Are you talking about like the immediate like burn severity where you can go out there and?
No, not necessarily. I'm just kind of curious if you had looked at that or had plans to kind of do any follow kind of work looking at it in those areas, and kind of looking at moisture retention and that kind of thing.
No, I know that we don't have any plans to look in that area, and we didn't look at it for this one. And Mike's actually frowning like he would have loved to do that.
Okay. Yeah. No, I just, as you know, the resiliency and climate change stuff is kind of on my mind a lot. So that was just something I was wondering about. Thanks.
Well, Judy has something too.
Oh, I was just going to say, Valerie, it usually comes down to funding. It can be expensive to do the soils work, so we usually have to prioritize, but we would love to have done it.
This is Tim.
Hello, was there another question?
Yeah. I was wondering if there was any estimation of what actual erosion runoff damage was at all.
Oh, not done by us. I actually did some folks on the ABRS do that. They were very, after the wallow, you know, the timeline of the wallow was right before monsoons, as typical of our southwestern forests, and there was a lot of concern about flooding, but it was not as bad as it was anticipated. That's all I'm kind of recollecting. We did not collect that data. I'm wondering if some ABRS personnel did. It's a good question, Tim. We'll look into that.
And touching on that, Amy, this is Kyle again. You might expect that it's not as much of a concern out there as it is somewhere like the Schultz Fire near Flagstaff, where you have really dramatic steep topography.
Well, the White Mountains have some pretty dramatic topography.
Yeah.
So I don't know. We do know that aspen regeneration was so fast in the wallow. And also, I'm going to look at, for Judy for this one, it's so fun for Judy to work over in the White Mountains because of the understory diversity and abundance, so different from our Colorado Plateau ponderosa pine. I don't know if that established understory.
Yeah, actually, that might be a good point. The establishment was incredibly fast. We were there in May. We did our overstory measurements first, then we went back to the same plots and did understory. And in May, a lot of the plots were just bare soil, but by late July when the monsoon started in August, it was pretty heavy regeneration of the understory in most areas, I would say.
And that would have been in 2012, though. So
that's true, yeah, you're right. So,
yeah.
Yeah,
it's a good question. There are definitely some gaps. I know we would also, when you're talking about resiliency, the one-year post is but the most difficult pill to swallow. So we would love to go back to these units in another couple of years and just assess, you know, trees still die following fires. It can take, you know, 5, even up to 10 years to show true mortality. Trees that maybe we called dead, maybe weren't quite dead, and they have a full crown again, those kinds of things. So it would be a great opportunity to go back to these plots, and they are permanently marked. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Great. Well, now you have to do your double duty and jump over to the final presentation. And just a reminder, we had to split Andrew's into two. So halfway through, you'll think you're at the end, but there's another half.
Okay, and I feel like, Xander, are we doing okay for time? I feel like, did I go over a little bit? We may not have as much time at the end for a lot of discussion.
Yeah, I think you can plug away here, and maybe I think folks who can stick around can continue to discuss.
Okay. Well, and I'm sorry I'm not Andrew Sanchez Meador. And for those of you who know him, you know my biggest challenge here is I can't talk nearly as fast as Andrew can. So I mean, I am actually really nervous about his presentation. So I've already kind of high graded, and even though Xander's already posted these, so I'm going to probably quickly go through and knock it into detail on a bunch of Andrew's slides, which you would, if Andrew were giving this, you would leave much more educated. But the main point is that we really wanted to share our long ecological assessment and restoration network that we call LEARN. These started in 1997. We just recently added one. And basically it's a partnership between scientists, researchers, and students and land managers, because these are on all different ownerships right now across northern Arizona, and we have one in southern Colorado as well. The main goal is to monitor the effects of forest ecosystem restoration prescriptions and different treatments. And I guess I already said they occur throughout the Southwest. I'm good. So how? Experiments. Yay, this is how we learn. So specific, we use restoration prescriptions varying from site to site. But I think what's really important is that we always maintain a control. And really, that's like these opportunistic studies are great, or looking at current management are awesome, but you really need to keep something the same to understand the actual effects of a treatment you're putting in. So that's the main thing, is we've set up these learns. We always, it's a replicated block design, which means we have multiple blocks of these different treatments. And our treatments can include restoration, a burn only in some jurisdictions, a minimal thin. We often adjust these prescriptions based on the jurisdiction we're in, because, for example, we have one in Grand Canyon National Park where their mission does not allow removal of timber for commercial purposes, which then makes it very hard to just even thin, but they are using burnt fires to get to their desired conditions. So we were able to include that on that project there. I feel the pressure to talk fast, sorry. Here's our network sites locations, and they're actually these little black dots. For instance, this is Mount Trumbull on the Parashant National Monument. We have North Rim of the Grand Canyon. We have South Rim of the Canyon, and also the Tusayan Ranger District on the Kaibab. 3 or 4 around Flagstaff, down in Mineral on the Apache Stickeries, and here's the one way up in southern Colorado, Pacosa. The new one is in blue. This is the Mogollon Rim, and I'm hoping to get to talk about that more. And I love this. You see the ones with the little flames on them? Those are ones where we have had unintended fire come into those sites. And often that becomes an opportunistic study. They burn with different severities among our treatments, the control and the restoration treatment. But unfortunately for us, they lose those study sites start to lose their scientific integrity to answer our questions anymore. But it's happening. Okay, I wanted to characterize the Flagstaff ones are up here on our Coconino Plateau. For those of you that get to enjoy more complex forest types, this is very simple. We have the largest stand of ponderosa pine in the world. Don't let anybody else tell you different. Look at how much data Andrew uses. Isn't this wonderful? We started way back in 1993 at the G.A. Pearson Natural Area with a very small restoration project. This is a total of 13 acres. And if you just look at the map, that little funny unit, this is a reconstructed 100% of that area to the trees that existed in 1876, which was the date of the last widespread fire from an Associated Fire History Study. This was what it looked like in 1992. And Judy might have even helped with the stem mapping. That was 100% stem map. Oh, it was JP. And this is, we divided it into 3 areas actually. Thinned and burned, a third of it. Thinned only, a third of it. It's studies like this that led, actually I'm going to skip ahead, boom, bada boom, to bigger areas. This is the Fort Valley area where we have 3 complete blocks with those 4 treatments. And also an opportunity to do treatments that our conservation advocacy groups wanted to see done. So these kind of longer, skinnier ones were done by groups that we were partnered with in the 90s. And so these areas, this was established in 98. Center of the universe. Last burned in 2014. Was that the 4th burn?
The 3rd.
That was the 3rd burn for it. They've been remeasured every 5 years. And a lot of additional studies have been done on there. I've looked for butterfly community differences among there. We've done mycorrhizae studies out there. It's just a great wealth of information. I'm going to skip over the Matt Hurto carbon stocks and wildfire, but that's fantastic stuff. Okay, the Grand Canyon, we have North Rim, a little bit of mixed conifer, but it's a really dry mixed conifer site. One of our, this was established in 1997. So far, it was remeasured after treatment, but only once. Does that sound correct? And it's been decommissioned, but it's there with good data on it, waiting for a researcher. I think I want to skip over this, but actually I may cover this because the Park Service is where we utilize the burn-only treatments. And there is a desire there to get back our fire resilient species, reduce tree densities to make it more resilient to these natural fires that were occurring. And we did confirm that surface fire had little effect on large ponderosa pine, dead fir, and white fir, and in particular there was a desire to try to reduce the white fir. The overall density of conifer seedlings. So it was effective definitely in reducing those small diameter trees. And then, as we all know now, the aspen regeneration exhibited significant mortality, but it is adapted to resprout. We're calling that. Okay, Mineral is a site over on the Apache Stickreaves. It's a fantastic site that includes a little bit of mixed conifer, a little bit of ponderosa pine, and even a little bit of pinon and juniper woodlands. Again, you'll see this block design. These cannot be done without our Forest Service partners, and they should chime in and tell you what a pain in the butt it is to implement all these treatments in the same year for our scientific design. So we really just have to shout out to our Forest Service partners for implementing these for us. These were last remeasured in the summer of 2013, and interestingly enough, San Juan fire burned into them in, was it 13 as well, right after we measured them? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And burned through one of our experimental blocks. And so we actually did revisit it this year just to capture the information from that. And the data is not yet analyzed, but site visits confirmed that the control burned with pretty high intensity and high severity patches. The restoration unit came through with pretty low mortality, looks very good, resilient to that kind of fire. And it also burns through burn only, right?
Correct.
Yeah. So we'll get that data out in the next year. Because I'm not talking as fast. Ooh, I get to go here now. Okay, I wanted to just share, Pagosa is another mixed conifer site, and this is that publication Judy referenced that Mike's just gotten out on some of our remeasured data there. It's another site that has a burn only and a thin and burn restoration, and what's neat about it is it's in the dry mixed conifer. We just remeasured it in 2013, and Mike's got that paper out. This is that paper. Do you want to? No, Mike's shaking me off. So what was really interesting here is that we measured these effects against climate simulations, and this is related exactly to that opportunistic wallow paper that I presented on. And when you model it out and look at the treatment starting conditions, Mike and others found that the thin and burn treatments appeared to be the most resilient, and that's defining resilience as maintaining those forest conditions with climate change coming. The unit and the controls with climate change modeled, and that was using FES, actually approached sparse forest conditions. So they just kept seeing high mortality and little regen. Did you model it with regen?
Little regen. Yes, the regen program or component to that is done.
Yeah, there's challenges in FES with the regeneration. I think that's an acknowledged gap. It's great to use these sites to model into the future, as well as take advantage of some opportunistic studies when wildfires overtake them. And then what Andrew really wanted to end with is we're just now establishing another mixed conifer site on the Mogollon Rim on the rim district of the Coconino National Forest. And so we've just history study that Dave Huffman completed nearby on Black Mesa. So this is dry mixed conifer, and this initial results, I don't know if you guys are all familiar with these graphs, but on the bottom here is a year, calendar year. Each horizontal line is a fire scar. Each vertical line represents a date on that fire scar that shows that fire occurred. So Dave and others collected 133 fire scars, found over 1,000 individual fires on those with, I don't need to go into it, but unique fire dates are when they only show up on that one fire scar. But really what we're looking for is when they show up on more than 25% of the samples. And when we just count those, we see a mean fire interval of 8.5 years with a range of 2 to 23 years. So there was a lot of fire in these mixed conifer sites. That's a great data set to have. That's also up on our website. So in this area, we're doing a control, again, a full restoration. But our opportunity here, which is the first time, is to really kind of capture the new recovery plan and do a Mexican spotted owl treatment. So we're hopefully working with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as well as the Rim District on developing prescriptions for that. Pre-treatment measurement is completed now, being analyzed, and we're hoping to, well, I'm going to skip this stuff, sorry, develop prescriptions, and then again, that implementation falls on our Forest Service partners, and then we'll jump back in for our post-treatment monitoring. It's really exciting to be working in the mixed conifer and kind of testing these things. It is where there's a lot of questions, and of course, any habitat that is important for our threatened and endangered species, we need to understand it more and see what the trends will be like in the future. So I'm sorry you had to listen to me the last half of the webinar, but I think that concludes, yay, that. And that was so fast, so blame Andrew. Discussion
Great
your questions.
job, Amy. So we can open it up here for questions or discussion. I think this is it's a great group on the line here, and so I think basically any topic is open from the material that Amy just presented from Andrew or any of the previous presentations. And you don't have to be shy.
I'm curious, Xander, this is Kyle again. I'm curious to ask all the folks joining in with us what they think appropriate measures of resilience are in these systems.
Good question.
Yeah, nice, Kyle.
Crickets.
So we have more work to do, Kyle. I think that's what that
yeah.
means.
Yeah, you know, I guess I think some of the stuff that you're doing, Amy, is great. I think that the post-fire response is probably one of the biggest ones. Measures of soil fertility, as somebody alluded to, I think that's probably a useful one as well.
Yeah.
I don't know what else you guys think.
Well, and I think really it's getting at some of those long-term responses. And I think with resiliency too, you would want to include modeling. We're very interested in where climate change impacts may be more intensified. We always think about ecotones and these
Yep.
areas of, like the rodeo tedeschi that maybe just aren't going to come back as our conifers, although alligator juniper is doing really well there from what I hear.
Mm-hmm.
It would be neat not to just define resiliency, but then look at the landscape in terms of where do you have the best chance of a resilient mixed conifer or a resilient ponderosa pine, And where are those areas where resiliency metrics are really going to change, because maybe that's just the most vulnerable to climate change. So I'd be really interested in looking at that.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. There's a paper that I was just reading, Sedema, Savage, and Mass from 2013. I don't know if folks are familiar with that one, but I think it does a great job of incorporating field data and modeling and climate envelope models of regeneration, and really gets at some of those questions.
Okay, cool. You know, the other thing, Xander, we wanted to ask folks are if there are key gaps that they find in their line of work and duties about mixed conifer forests, because we always, right, like Judy says, we always end a study with more questions, but we know that there's a lot of questions out there too. We'd love to accumulate those and try to keep finding funding to address them and things. So you can email them to Xander, or you can list them on this comment, but we would love to keep that kind of conversation open and still hear about the data gaps you guys have in mixed conifer.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, Amy, and do feel free to email me or Barb, depending on whatever email is easiest for you to find. But I think that is a great question, particularly for folks you know, who are in charge of a piece of ground and say, look, I just don't know how to address this problem or question. And I think that's certainly part of ERI's mission, the Ecological Restoration Institute. It's also, you know, bridging that gap is what the Southwest Fire Science Consortium tries to do. So there's a lot of interest in linking up questions on the ground with researchers able to answer those questions, or at least attempts to answer them. So thank you for mentioning that, Amy. And maybe at an hour and a half, we've exhausted people.
I think
but
so.
I think all the presenters did a really nice job in bringing together in a concise way some just voluminous information. So I personally, as a fellow researcher, really appreciate it. And we will have the recording available online. Kent asked about that. I'll touch base with you, Amy, about some version perhaps of these, the actual presentations, if that's something that maybe in some modified format or a PDF or something, that might be possible as well. And a follow-up email will come from the consortium to let you know about where the recording is, in case you want to share this with colleagues or anything like that. So Amy, unless you have other announcements or anything else, or if there are any last questions, we can wrap it up.
I think we're good here.
Okay, well, thanks again, and thanks to all the participants.
Yeah, thank you, Xander.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Talk to you guys later.